Part 2. Creating your career plan. 5. Getting yourself ready. Think about this for a moment. So much of our life is mapped out, on paper or on screen. We determine the fastest route to the movie theater or shopping mall, taking into account the time of day, weather, and resulting traffic patterns. We plan out our vacations, booking hostels or hotels way in advance for the most popular destinations and the most popular times. You wouldn't show up in New Orleans for Mardi Gras without a reservation. And I can't imagine many people merely landed in Vancouver for the Winter Olympics without a place to stay and tickets to an event. As we get older, there is so much we plan carefully, from our weddings to home ownership, to retirement. And yet, ironically, we don't put anything close to that much thought into planning our careers, which is one of the most crucial parts of our lives, and a major part from which so much else flows. I ask, maybe beg you to recognize how critical it is to develop a solid career plan, one that takes into account your personal hopes and dreams as well as the competitive economy, and one that leaves itself open to be adjusted as you go. A well-designed plan guards you from the dangers and mistakes I described in the last chapter. And a plan allows you to efficiently harvest the opportunities open to you. Determine the destination. I encounter people all the time who truly can't describe their goals precisely. To be happy, to be fulfilled, to make a contribution, to make a difference. None of those statements, genuine though they might be, is any more than a starting point for setting your goals. They're too general and vague in scope to support a plan. They provide no way to set priorities, to measure progress, or to evaluate tactics. Heather understood this. She was on her way to becoming an accountant. And she was very happy about it. She saw accounting as a fascinating profession, where, with a relatively small set of numbers, she could predict the future and then shape the outcome of major corporate decisions. In other words, she and a balance sheet would change the world. With her passion clearly identified, she started to clarify her other goals. Since work was going to be such a big part of her life, she wanted her career and her life to be integrated right from the beginning. She wanted to be happy. Her most immediate personal priority was to travel the world. Heather felt an absolute hunger to visit and explore as many countries, geographies, and cultures as possible. And she wanted an income that allowed her to travel in style. The life of a global backpacker did not appeal to her. She didn't want to sleep in airports or in bunk rooms with dozens of others, and she wanted to sample the local cuisine instead of subsisting on baguettes and cheese. Finally, when the time was right, she was sure she would want a family. So Heather's career destination involved the following. 1. Work in accounting that allowed her potentially to have a major impact. 2. A high income. 3. The opportunity to travel the world early in her career. Like Heather, Trent also started with the plan that he thought would make him happiest. He wanted to be a management consultant, and he had the education required for an entry-level job. Specifically, he wanted to help companies achieve game-changing productivity gains. He hated travel and wanted to live downtown in a big city. He wanted an active social and dating life. He did not want to work long hours. His primary financial need was enough income to afford a downtown condo. He also figured that, among women he dated, one might qualify as a wife, eventually. As you can see, in his own way he was as ambitious as Heather. To put it in an organized form, his goals included 1. A job in management consulting, focusing on productivity. 2. A downtown lifestyle. 3. A reasonable number of work hours without travel. Perhaps you think Trent and Heather are wildly unrealistic? Maybe. Maybe not. But they are right to start with their fondest desires and then to try and get as close to them as possible. Think of it like real estate. No house hunter goes into the shopping process without the starting point of a wish list that includes everything they want. It's a powerful exercise. On the flip side, notice how many people start with the totally modest goal of just an entry-level job related to their major. Then, if they achieve that, they think of what other goal they might add. Are you surprised that if you first dumb down your goals to almost nothing, you will struggle to get Anywhere else? I know that in this competitively challenging world, you are often told by veterans of the system to be practical. By that they usually mean you should set your sights very low and pretty much forget about the dream of finding passion in your work. But remember that competition is the very reason you need to find a career you're passionate about. I want to be very practical about it all. I'm an economist, and we're the prophets of practicality. Planning your career is the passionate worker's answer to the need to be practical. And you must start with the best possible destination. Ricardo had deep resistance to adopting goals for his career, never mind for his life. He was the child of immigrants, and so happy to be part of the first generation in a new country that he seemed all too willing to take any reasonable job open to him. And he did, as a manager at a bank. Fast forward a few years, and he was still there. No, he didn't love his job, but he figured he would try to have the best life he could anyway. Ricardo had defined a passion, though: real estate. To him, a job in real estate would have been akin to winning the lottery, both in terms of the happiness it would bring and in the unlikeliness of it ever happening. Is Ricardo more likely to succeed because of his more constrained choices? Is he wise not to tempt the fates by being too ambitious? The plain truth is that Ricardo and his situation drove me to distraction. I hate waste of any kind, and that's what I saw with Ricardo. We live in a world where so much talent is wasted because people lower their sights from the start and think anything more is a bonus. It wouldn't have bothered me so much if Ricardo didn't have such deep talent. When he talked about real estate projects that had been built, he saw so many things wrong with them. But more than that, he saw so many opportunities to make them better, and countless missed opportunities to add to a project's profitability. And when he talked about what might be built, his visions were plainly impressive, sensitive to their environments, and often unlike anything he or I had seen. Unfortunately, I could see him spending the next 20 years at his bank job, helping people get loans for homes or properties that were so much less interesting than what he might have created. And with his apparently unassertive approach to life, I could see Ricardo himself living in an average house with an average spouse and 1.5 average children, never seeking excellence in any of his endeavors. So what did I do in my frustration? I shouted at him to get unrealistic. It was indeed a struggle, but finally he got on a similar page to Heather and Trent. He allowed that he sort of wanted to be a developer. And yes, maybe he had fantasized about having a big family and living in the countryside. Now we had somewhere to begin. His destination was becoming clearer. You too should set goals like Heather, Trent, and Ricardo have done. And then ask yourself if your goal, though it may be lofty, is also flexible. In other words, do you have your goal set at a pinpoint? You do not want that. If you are completely certain of exactly what company you want to work for, your goal is a pinpoint. If you are completely set on an obscure area of study or focus, such as weaponry of the 3rd century, then your goal is a pinpoint. Broaden your range. You may be thinking, but you just told me to be precise. And that is true. I did say that. But use common sense. A goal as broad as I want to be happy is meaningless, and one as narrow as I want to do this job at this place is only going to set you up for failure. It's smart to have a destination, but in the uncertainty of the world, you need to give yourself wiggle room to accommodate changes. The market might change. You might change. Start with a broad range, and don't think about narrowing so much as you think about researching. As you work at the task of researching, clarity will come on its own. Distinguish your priorities. Having decided what would make them happy, Heather, Trent, and Ricardo needed to assign priorities to their main goals. This was the first step to practicality. Not everything might be possible at once. Again, it's like house hunting. Perhaps you want a fireplace, but of the items on your wish list, where does it rank? Could you live without one if you needed to make such a choice? Could you add a fireplace later? Similarly, when it comes to career planning, each factor should have a useful measure of flexibility. Heather identified factors that were less important to her and came to the conclusion that, of the great range of work she could do as an accountant, she could happily put her mind to most of it as long as she had a major impact on the outcome. So she had at least one constraint that was minimized. In addition, while she expected a relatively high income over the course of her career, a high starting salary was less important than the opportunity to travel. She'd backpack if she really had to. Trent did the same thing and decided he was determined to work on productivity improvements and nothing else if he could possibly do so. He felt he was being flexible by not caring about exactly what kinds of productivity he would work on. He also concluded he might be willing to travel a little, and work longer hours than he wanted, at least in the beginning of his career. But condo life downtown was very important, second only to his work. Do you think Heather and Trent are still too unrealistic? If so, do you not think they are better off finding out about what is feasible and what is not, rather than assuming it? Ricardo and I continued our battle over the issue of priorities, because, although I'd talked him into telling me where he'd ultimately like to go, he assumed that none of it was really possible. It involved a lot of dialogue, wherein I asked questions like, if you had to amend or delay part of your dream, which part would it be? And Ricardo gave me passive answers. Like, any of it, Professor. Like I said, I can just work at the bank for the rest of my life, it's okay. And so it went on and on this way. We'll return to Ricardo in a bit, for a point finally came when we stopped going in circles and really made some progress on his plan. So now you might try taking your own stab at this exercise, and do please use Heather and Trent as your models, not Ricardo. How do you rank your goals? Which could you make more flexible if you had to? What is non-negotiable for you? Identify the specific barriers to achieving your goals. Now that you have begun to define your most desired goals, and to think about where they fall in terms of importance to you, the next step is to identify what barriers stand in the way. Aggressive goals, by their very nature, force you to think carefully about the obstacles. Obstacles you might have assumed were immovable or not, you might not have noticed some true obstacles until they flattened you. It didn't take Heather long to recognize the primary barriers to her goals. First, accounting jobs are usually rooted in one location in one office, in one city. Second, in the beginning she wouldn't get anywhere near high-impact files. As a junior accountant, she would do less interesting work, the boring stuff. And while her income would be reasonable, it was not traveling in style high. But it didn't matter anyway, because her vacation time in her early years would be modest at best. Over time, her vacation income and impact would improve, but by that stage she hoped to have kids, and traveling the world with babes in arms would only be harder. Trent was also in an apparently impossible situation. With an entry-level position, he would have little choice in the work he would do, at least until he was older, like, say, 40, which to him was an eternity away. Moreover, management consulting normally involves long hours and a lot of travel. Or at least it would if Trent got a job with a major firm. The large firms typically had downtown offices, which was a plus, so Trent could live and work downtown and afford a small condo. But the problem was, he could only live there in between business trips. As a consequence, his social life would be transient, intermittent. By contrast, if Trent worked for a smaller firm, his income would probably be too low for his dreamed of condo. Moreover, these firms rarely were located downtown. So what should Heather and Trent do? Do both of them have to get realistic? Shouldn't Heather just pay her dues as an accountant? Get the best position available and travel on her vacations? Or if her travel bug cannot be delayed or denied, she could delay the start of her career and backpack the world, getting used to the appeal of youth hostels. And perhaps Trent needs to accept a long apprenticeship and choose which is more important to him, long hours and living downtown or less time commitment in a smaller firm in the suburbs. Surely, he could find a healthy social life in the burbs, if he had to. Perhaps following the suggestions in the preceding paragraph is what normal people would do. But Heather and Trent were determined to have great careers, not just good ones. So Heather and Trent moved to the next step in their planning. The critical point here is, there will be obstacles to the course you've set. List them objectively. Don't worry that you're being negative, don't think ahead about how to remedy them. At this stage, simply think it through and identify them. Probe the barriers and revise your goals if necessary. Heather and Trent recognized that there are always obstacles to accomplishment, and certainly to great careers. And barriers cannot be wished away, nor are intention and effort enough. The universe does not actually care if travel or downtown living is important to you, so wishing for a lucky break simply won't do. Heather and Trent decided that, if they wanted to have real workplace impact and to realize their personal goals, they would have to find a way to include them. Or strictly speaking, they at least should try. Heather began her probe by looking for examples of how other accountants pursued unconventional career paths. Even if they weren't trying to travel the world, the unusual nature of their progress might help her see a way around her obstacles. The results, though, were not promising. Accounting, like many other professions, from architecture to engineering, has a relatively prescribed career path. Or at least it does if you want to stay in the profession and get your credentials or establish your reputation. The only accountants who traveled a lot were either associated with large multinational clients or were specialists who flew around the world to deal with exceptional situations. But those positions were restricted, not surprisingly, to highly experienced, that is to say, older accountants. Heather, as I've said, did not want to wait. She had now clarified her career direction. And if she wanted to be an accountant, it was clear she would have to learn patience. But there was another way. Heather could set aside the goal of being an accountant and pursue a career in quantitative analysis. Quantitative analysts still work with numbers, so she'd still have her ledger book, but she would not technically be called an accountant. In other words, the way around the barrier was to rethink the conventional description of the job itself. Heather gave the matter much consideration. She decided she would complete the requirements for an accounting degree, since she was so close. But she decided not to take the additional steps, exams and so forth, required to achieve an official accounting qualification. Heather understood what many do not, that passions do not always exactly fit established occupations. Her career plan now had a revised career goal. She would solve high-impact problems using quantitative analysis outside of accounting. In other words, she could still put her mind to work on why a company's product or business was stagnating, but she wouldn't be the company's accountant. She'd have a different title. Since she would not have the credibility of her professional designation to help her, she might have to compromise on some of her personal goals. But travel was still a high priority as she considered her next steps. Let me be clear. The point of this example is not that accounting is a poor career choice. It is not, but it was for Heather. An occupation, a career, is great only if it is your passion. And if it meets your other high priority goals. Trent was struggling as he probed his obstacles. Large firms all expected him to travel, and the smaller firms he looked at offered pay that simply did not support his cherished downtown lifestyle. And few firms would allow him much of a choice in the type of job he worked on. He could not request to focus on productivity. He decided to check out every possible firm to see if there were any exceptions to the traditional approach. There were a few firms that specialized in productivity, but they only hired consultants who were much more experienced than Trent. As is true for many types of occupations and careers, Trent was too young and inexperienced to be taken seriously. The same problem affects the older worker like Ricardo, who wants to change careers but lacks experience in a different domain. So Trent needed more education to have any control over the nature of the problems he would get to tackle. And downtown living would probably have to wait. In short, Trent was on his way back to school. Ricardo, meanwhile, had finally become convinced to seek what it was that he most wanted. With a decade of excellent performance reviews at the bank under his belt, he had the credibility to look for a junior position in the real estate industry. He was probably most qualified to be a salesperson, but what he really wanted was a project management job with a developer. Unfortunately, he had no experience at all in real estate, though he had done a decade's worth of reading on the subject. The road to being a developer looked long indeed. I asked him if he might raise enough money to do a small project on his own, something modest, like a renovation of a store in a strip mall. It didn't have to be all-consuming, it could be a part-time endeavor while he continued working at the bank. After all, I said, the best way to start a career is to start. I don't have money even for a modest project, Ricardo protested. No one in my family does, either. And a bank's not going to lend me money. Given my inexperience, that I know for sure. Ricardo could find more reasons not to do something than almost anyone I knew. You see why he frustrated me so? You don't have any relatives with a few dollars? I pushed. No, he said, but then was quiet. Well, yes. I have an uncle who's well off, but I'm not going to ask him for money. He's a self-made man, he'd expect me to be, too. Why would you ask for a gift? I asked. Why wouldn't you offer him an opportunity to invest in a project you've identified and designed? At last, Ricardo looked like 1,000 light bulbs had gone off in his head. He had never thought of his extended family as investors. Yes, he was too old to ask for presents, but he could offer them a competitive rate of return. Maybe he could even best what his uncle was being offered elsewhere. Ricardo immediately set about identifying a project to take on. And when he had one, he set up a business meeting with his uncle. My first business meeting, he said when he called to tell me about it. The pride in his voice was clear. In Ricardo's case, unlike those of Heather and Trent, his obstacle had faded upon examination. The point of this phase is to probe, to determine what is rock solid and what is not. Are you looking for workarounds? Are you making assumptions about defined job titles or careers that can be dismantled? Are you falling victim to conventional thinking? Are you rushing to know too quickly? Identify, acquire, and strengthen the key skills you need. When I argued in Chapter 2 that you couldn't build a great career on skills without passion, I didn't say skills were unnecessary or optional. When you have a passionate objective, you are in fact driven to acquire skill, since without it you can't satisfy your heart's desire. That's a far more powerful motivator than money alone can ever be. To acquire skills, far too many people see merely one path, school or some sort of similar educational program. But this mass market technique for skill development leaves you no better off than an army of others. Or people accept the same progression of experience that others have followed. And, like sheep, move along. To their credit, Heather, Trent, and Ricardo looked more critically at their alternatives. They did not make mistake number 3 of following the herd. Heather decided that her accounting program had already given her most of the quantitative skills she needed to get an analyst job. A few more specialized courses were all that she needed to supplement them. As she investigated possible occupations where her quantitative analysis skills were in demand, she happened upon management consulting. As an accountant, she had a credible shot at getting a junior position. But a credible shot was not something that appealed to her planning zeal. She wanted an edge, especially because someone, can't imagine who, had terrified her about the highly competitive pressures of the modern economy. So she sought out a retired consultant who had worked at a major firm and interrogated him. Heather learned that competition for clients among the big firms was intense, and the ability to find and retain key clients was much prized. That's all Heather needed to know. Show me how to do that, she said. She cleverly and truthfully told him that he should not let his business experience go to waste. Heather made herself into his apprentice. Retired though he was, Trent had a different skills problem. He wanted to be a productivity consultant, a subset of management consultants. So unless he wanted to age and grow into having these responsibilities, his undergraduate education in business had to be added to with a graduate degree. The logical choice was to get an MBA. However, sensitive to the fact that many MBAs graduate every year and that many management consultants have MBAs, Trent was not confident that this additional degree would give him distinction. Again, getting an MBA is an excellent step to a great career, but it depends on your goals and circumstances. Trent thought, if I want to be a high-level productivity expert, I'd better find a specialized graduate program. Alas, no such program could be found. Looking is always better than not looking, but looking doesn't guarantee you'll find anything useful. But Trent didn't give up or take the easy path, which would have been to get his MBA anyway. Instead, he became creative. He began to look for a graduate program where he would be allowed to do research into productivity tools. In other words, he would be able to serve his own purposes, with help from the educational institution. Ricardo approached his skills deficiency differently. He had read himself into considerable competence, but he knew he lacked hands-on experience. In particular, Ricardo felt he needed to better understand financing. He thought about finding a mentor, but he wanted to start his new project right away. And time was short. So Ricardo decided to improvise, but in a planned way. He would hire professionals to work on his project, and learn skills from them as he went. At this stage, Heather, Trent, and Ricardo avoided a major mistake. Many people get an issue half right and then fail to press their advantage. Heather, for example, could have just had casual conversations with her mentor. Trent could have chosen any research degree to start, and Ricardo could have just improvised the acquisition of financing skills. Each, however, developed a clear, precise plan to build their skill base. In other words, they established benchmarks, which we will go over in detail here. Heather and her mentor prepared a series of meetings and introductions to accomplish very specific objectives covering all aspects of high-impact analysis, including how to attract clients. Trent exhaustively researched his prospective grad programs, having developed a set of criteria. His new education was supposed to buy him entry to productivity consulting, and he was leaving nothing to chance. To ensure that his vision was supported by experience in execution, Ricardo outsourced as much of the work on his strip mall project as he could. And then he decided to supervise very carefully, principally to learn what his partners were doing and, by questioning them, to find out why they were doing it. In other words, Ricardo would mostly be learning, instead of supervising. Next time, he would be smarter, and eventually he would be able to supervise knowledgeably. From this trio you can learn to ask yourself the most critical skills questions. What skills do you still need that you are lacking? How can you get them? How much time do you have to do so? Are you looking at non-traditional methods for acquiring these skills, or are you just following the conventional wisdom? Put your team in place. Career success is almost never a solo achievement. Yes, networking is important, but what I'm advocating is something that goes beyond the network as it is usually understood. Of all the people I have known who have struggled in their careers in spite of following their passions, the most common reason for their struggles is their inability to mobilize a team. Notice I said a team, not a network. It doesn't matter what the nature of your work is, whether you're in a small organization or a large one, a tech company or a manufacturer. Even in the notoriously isolated high-tech world, loners will struggle. Yes, they will get a job with decent pay, but after a time, with increasing stress, highly talented people start to resent their lack of control over their jobs. More often than not, it's this lack of control that holds them back from having a truly great career, and yet they could have fixed this if they'd had a team in place. They feel usually correctly that their talent is being wasted. If only they weren't so scared of strangers. What is the difference between a network and a team? A network of people you know, and who think of you in a positive way, is one of the pools from which you recruit your team. Unlike a network, which should be so big you cannot from memory recall all of its members, a team is small, cohesive, and ready, and able to help you achieve your career goals. The network is merely available, but the team is on call. And if you, wisely, integrate key life goals into your career plan, the team is also important to the achievement of the plan for your life. The team often includes people of varying connections to you, some family, friends, acquaintances, workmates, and your own hired professionals. Your team helps you plan, create, and execute. Heather had recruited her key mentor, but that was only her start. There was no way she could learn everything she needed to know about finding clients from a single person. If it were that easy, everyone would be doing it, and she would have no advantage. Her mentor had advised her that she would have to practice, not just learn, what needed to be done. So Heather set to work. She hired a professional researcher to brief her on likely new markets. Another member of her team, a valued friend and neighbor, arranged for her to attend a key trade show that was closed to the public. Her grandfather, a retired executive, listened to her practice her pitches. Are you starting to see why Heather is a force to be reckoned with? Trent's team was heavily skewed toward professors who could help him evaluate his various graduate school educational choices. In addition, a classmate connected him with a retired senior executive at a global manufacturer who would know which firms did the best work in productivity. Trent also read almost every recent paper on productivity and tried to get a personal interview with the authors who most interested him. In essence, he was still putting his core team in place. His most serious challenge was finding someone who could help him finance his university research. Otherwise, he'd be a prisoner of his supervisor's own funding constraints. Ricardo was fortunate, since his oncoming construction project brought him into contact with a wide range of professionals, government officials, bankers, tenants, and trade contractors. He auditioned all of them for his team, and in doing so, tried to learn everything he could from them. He also paid his accountant to brief him on an ongoing basis. Team Ricardo was healthy and strong. A team is not a group that will do your bidding. Rather, team members are in a relationship with you, and a relationship is never a one-way street. You're not a kid anymore, and no one's looking after you simply for the sake of looking after you. Make a case to people as to why it's good for them to join your team. For instance, a mentor might be an employee of a corporation that one day might want to recruit you. Or think about how Heather approached her mentor. She knew he was eager to do something that tapped into all of his experience. From his end, he wanted to pay it forward, pay it into the future, where his experience would long outlive him. And Heather could also give him something back, which was her own unique, millennials view of the world. There was much that Heather knew that her mentor did not, and her perspective was, at the very least, interesting to him. Sometimes members of your team will be paid, like Ricardo's accountant, but money should not be the driver for most of your team members. It should be based upon relationship. Though Ricardo was paying contractors to do work for his project, he wasn't paying them to teach him. They did that for free, because they likely saw potential in Ricardo and could see a long-term working relationship with him. And who knows? Perhaps they even charged him the lower end of their fee. Stranger things have happened. Heather, Trent, and Ricardo have completed some very heavy lifting in this chapter. We've seen them through the first critical steps in their career planning. They've decided where they want to go and what they can let go of. They've isolated the major obstacles to their goals and really probed them to make sure there was no give. They've strengthened the skills they knew they'd need, and they've put their teams in place. And yet there's more work to do. For now comes what is perhaps the most crucial part of their plan, finding the edge that will set them apart. Hard questions, honest answers. 1. What is your particular destination? 2. How do you rank your priorities? 3. What barriers stand in your way? Are they firm or can you move around them? 4. Who is truly on your team? 6. Find your edge. The author J.K. Rowling could have written a good book instead of a great one. But she wanted an innovative story and remained true to her artistic vision. She violated all the rules of kids' books, which at the time said that nothing should be too scary or too long, and that all the adults must be noble. As the whole world now knows, the strategy worked out quite well for her. If all you can produce from your work is a good result, you're not generating a competitive response. You're no better than most everyone else. So why would you expect to get any special advantage? You have to develop an attribute beyond skill. This means you need to create solutions that are highly innovative, solutions that are found in few other places, if any. Let's return to our trio, Heather, Trent, and Ricardo, and how they faced the issue of finding their edge. Heather did not immediately see why her mentor pushed her to figure out what her special insight was going to be. She couldn't just want to have an impact on important problems through numerical analysis. Was she going to use a mathematical technique no one else thought to use? Or was she going to find a source of data no one else had or used? How was she going to solve problems using exceptional techniques? Slowly she realized that he was pushing her to find a systemic advantage as a problem solver, that it was not enough just to be smarter. Heather was amazed that, for all the excitement surrounding quantitative analysis, the so-called big data, there was very little attention being paid to ensuring the accuracy of the source data or even its consistency over time. Heather found a way to greatly improve this quality, and she was offered an excellent position. She still didn't travel as much as she'd hoped, but it didn't seem to matter to her as much. And she made the most out of the traveling she did do, with a well-thought-out plan. Naturally, Trent faced a different version of the same need. He intended to use a piece of research to launch his career as a productivity consultant. But that still left him trying to decide which important productivity problem he was going to solve, and where. And if it was important and still unsolved, then it must be very difficult to solve. Why did he think he could solve it? What was his truly special insight? What mistakes were others making that he could avoid? With the help of the team he put together, Trent chose a graduate program with great flexibility and built a curriculum for himself that allowed him time to do extensive research. Also through his team, he found out about a grant opportunity and secured funding to research how to organize manufacturing supply chains more productively. After graduate school, he was hired by a firm specializing in productivity consulting, even though they typically recruited people with more experience. But they loved his ideas, and they gave him a shot. He loves his condo, which he is slowly filling with furniture, and from the little he tells me on the matter, it appears his social life is also going well. Ricardo was already exploring his distinction, set off by his prodigious reading. He wanted to use unusual design details to create architecturally distinguished and affordable buildings. But since he was trying to move quickly, he had to avoid adding details that slowed construction unduly. He had his edge, that was the easy part. The challenge was that he needed to remain focused and committed to executing his creative vision quickly. Ricardo's strip mall project was a success, and he now knows that he loves being a property developer. What these three stories illustrate is that it isn't enough just to have a passion, or even a passion and a plan. You must also have a defining distinction, or an edge. And that distinction involves the skill of creativity. 100% of the time. Don't think you're creative? Think again. By the end of this chapter, you will see not only how crucial creativity is, but how to bring it out in yourself. Yolanda and Cliff, imitate versus innovate. Yolanda was certain that being creative just wasn't her thing. And that's why what happened to her was entirely predictable. Yolanda was, in many ways, a model employee. She loved her work as head of the human resources team in a growing company. She thoroughly enjoyed the challenge of matching the right person to the right job, and she derived great satisfaction from doing so. Yolanda was even very careful to provide helpful feedback to applicants who failed to be hired, so that they might improve their prospects. She was committed to her own professional development and that of her staff through training, conferences, and workshops. It was therefore bitterly disappointing when she was terminated after being with the company for more than a decade. Her boss tried to explain his decision. He reminded her that she had been cautioned to correct a weakness in her performance, and she had failed to do so. Out of respect for her years of service, he offered her a good reference, which omitted the actual reason she had been let go. That was small consolation for Yolanda, who still seemed not to understand what had happened to her. So what had cost Yolanda her job? If you think she was a model employee, she was but for the year 1980. Here's what went wrong. Yolanda's employer was an up-and-coming company in a very competitive marketplace, and they believed that the quality of their employees was essential to maintaining their momentum. But over the past several years, the company felt that their competitors had been hiring better quality employees than they had. Yolanda had been asked to improve their hiring and staff retention strategies. But her efforts had been judged inadequate, since all she had done was duplicate the policies and programs of the other companies. When criticized, she had protested, saying that she had implemented HR industry best practices. What more did they want? She wondered. A lot more, it turns out. By merely matching the best practices of her employer's competitors, Yolanda had provided no real competitive advantage. And that advantage is exactly what the company wanted and needed, especially since they hadn't been around as long as some of the competition. Competitive advantage meant creating and adopting recruitment and retention practices no one else was using. As a result, when Yolanda used a technique she learned about from a conference, she was still just imitating, not innovating. In times past, Yolanda's approach would have been good enough for her employer to withstand competition. But unfortunately, we are no longer in an era of good enough. All of Yolanda's training had been to recognize the smart ideas of others and to implement them appropriately. But here's the problem, that's the same training that armies of other college-educated HR professionals have had. In an age of rising standards, more is needed, longer hours, faster work, fewer mistakes. And still the competitive pressure mounts, for now. We also need new answers, better answers, and more innovative answers. Yolanda did not know how to deliver that standard. Neither did Cliff, and he was on the edge of panic, fearing a recently won promotion would slip through his fingers. An engineer in love with engineering, he had developed a reputation in his company for his high level of technical proficiency. When given a problem, he typically applied his wealth of knowledge to deliver an effective solution at reasonable cost. As a result of his consistent track record, he was made assistant head of research and development. His first task was to lead a team to create a game-changing new product. Alas, the team's initial meeting was a disaster. The team looked to him for leadership and he looked to them for ideas. And both he and they quickly lost confidence in each other. Yolanda and Cliff struggled because their employers were under competitive pressure. Simply working harder, faster, or longer would not address their employer's need for a competitive advantage. Cliff needed to innovate to hold on to his job. And Yolanda wasn't sure what she needed to do to get another job. How did Yolanda and Cliff get themselves into this position? Remember, both are very much pursuing their passions. The problem was that they had assumed that their passion, education, and experience were all that were necessary. And it would have been in the past. When I pressed them, both acknowledged that competition was increasing and that it was likely to continue increasing indefinitely. They also agreed that the workplace was going to keep getting more challenging. But despite recognizing all this, they did not take it a step farther. They did not try to define the consequences of what they already knew was happening and then address those consequences. Since Yolanda and Cliff are alert and ambitious, their failure to worry about what the future held may seem somewhat surprising, until you realize the main issue affecting them both. The villain, conventional thought. Yolanda and Cliff were pursuing their passions, but in every other aspect of their lives they were bound to standard convention. They were strongly affected by their families, friends, and workmates, who towed the line and stayed safely within the norm. Do your work, do it well, come home, go. Do it again. But thinking about the future in a methodical way is definitely not a herd exercise. As Cliff said, the future seems kind of scary. Yes, if You ignore the future, it certainly can scare you. And both Cliff and Yolanda were scared now. Cliff was now ready to get serious about how to innovate. He didn't have a lot of time before his job self-destruct, and he knew it. Yolanda, however, was still in denial. Well, sort of. She saw the logic behind my advice that she needed to innovate, but she'd already lost her job. Maybe, she said hesitantly, I can get my next job based on my experience. Then, sure, after I'm hired, I'll probably need to learn to innovate. I mean, eventually. You seem reluctant, I noted. Professor, she said, I'm just not creative. Conventional thought was paralyzing Yolanda. She assumed she would be unsuccessful at adapting, and so she didn't try to. She thought, even hoped, it would still all work out somehow. I hate conventional thought. It lurks, even in the background. And it shapes your ideas without revealing itself explicitly, thus making it extremely powerful. I see it as a villain in the night, determined to subvert human talent. Again and again, I've seen this villain waste people's potential. Toe the line, follow the leader, if it ain't broke, don't fix it all, are examples of conventional thought hiding within cliques. Of course, conventional ideas do change over time, but progress is slow. And in the time it usually takes to change them, we are collectively set back. A year wasted is a year lost forever, never to be regained. And as the drumbeat of competition increases, conventional thought lags behind reality by ever greater degrees. In short, I saw Yolanda and Cliff becalmed in an ocean of conventionality, and they were drifting toward the rocks. They both felt that innovating was the job of the boss, whether they admitted it or not. That's a dangerous assumption to make. The herd tells itself that creativity is only for the special few. Those rare individuals who can think up new stuff are true geniuses or weird anomalies. This tends to be a brilliant excuse for most people to avoid even an attempt at innovation. Most people don't innovate, ergo, they can't. If we need a solution to a problem, we solve it using yesterday's ideas, or we wait for the boss to find a solution. As a result, are you surprised that so many struggle in their careers? So how was I going to liberate Yolanda and Cliff from conventionality? There are never easy answers when important issues are on the table. And the full realization of talent is, for me, of the utmost importance. It is the prize truly worth fighting for. Understanding innovation. Yolanda and Cliff needed to think about innovation and its companion, creativity, a lot. And given their conventional views, there was much for them to learn. First, they needed to define creativity. When Yolanda insisted she was not creative, I asked what that meant. She said she had no artistic ability at all. By art, she meant the visual, dramatic, and musical arts. And what does that possibly have to do with innovation in HR processes? I asked. If I have no artistic ability, I can't create anything new. She had no evidence for that assertion. Clearly, she had not seriously thought about innovation. Art wasn't her passion, HR was. Why would one be connected to the other? The only reason to worry about artistic creativity is if you want to be an artist. Yolanda needed to be innovative in HR. She needed to understand everything about that specific kind of innovation. While reading one of the many books about the process of innovation can be useful, I suggested as a first priority that both Yolanda and Cliff read about the last century's innovations in their respective fields. They needed to know what the innovations were exactly. How were they created? What caused them to succeed or fail? Who typically created them? As an unemployed job seeker, Yolanda now had some time available to do what she should have been doing for years already. But she was now starting, at least. Cliff felt under much more pressure, since his employer was still waiting for action, or at least a plan of action. Determined to hold on to his promotion, Cliff threw himself into reading about innovations in his field of electrical engineering. He was now starting to understand the kind of innovation he cared about. He found his reading of great interest and admitted that in the past, while he had read a little about recent innovations, He had been neither particularly methodical nor analytical. If only I had more time, he said wearily. In spite of Yolanda's skepticism and Cliff's anxiety, they both had a powerful competitive edge. They loved their work and the subject of their reading was inherently interesting. Yolanda actually said it was fascinating, as she noted that most of what she was reading was unknown to her. Imagine how difficult it would be to do this kind of extensive reading if you did not find the subject interesting, if it wasn't your passion. I have watched too many people try to create innovations in fields that the crowd tells them are hot. We talk. They want me to suggest a single perfect book for their needs. They usually say it's because they don't have a lot of time. Perhaps. But I suspect they see the reading as grinding, hard work. And I rarely see such persons develop anything new other than minor iterations of what others have already created. It took Yolanda longer than Cliff to identify the innovations that had happened in her field. But find them she did. She learned about the workplace of the early 20th century, where the rule of the day was command and control. She learned how the psychological testing of job applicants had evolved, why skills-based testing had failed in many applications, and how the use of social media had grown quickly to recruit and evaluate candidates. And that was just a sample of what she'd learned. But what to do with all this research still stymied her. She needed to identify a current-day problem or issue in HR. What is your problem? With Yolanda's knowledge of and passion for HR, she was gradually able to identify a number of key HR problems: how to recruit talent, how to retain talent, how to grow talent. Yolanda also saw that she needed to break down these big problems into smaller components. Under recruitment, there were the associated problems of identifying who you want, finding them, getting them to listen to your message, understanding what exactly they want, and verifying their credentials and references. She now had to figure out how to rank the importance of these problems. For example, where was the biggest failure, since fixing it would produce the biggest benefit for the employer? Cliff had made little progress on the problem identification side. He struggled with understanding exactly what his employer had meant by a game-changing new product. Cliff would have been so happy if the employer had just said to make a specific product cheaper, whereas game-changing seemed to be about a big market hit. And markets relevant to his employer were not something Cliff thought about a lot. He was completely honest with me about it. Actually, he said he never thought about it. That was the job of his boss, he figured. But this promotion, which he had wanted badly and actively sought, made him a junior boss. And as a boss in training, he was still in trouble. Desperate. He privately hired a consultant to help him identify key problems. He paid for this advice himself. He found a good consultant who knew how to ask questions. Cliff had always been good at identifying technical problems, but now he was tutored in identifying business problems. First, Cliff needed to look at which products were slow sellers and why. What category of products close to the company's offerings was growing rapidly? The consultant showed him how to look. Cliff couldn't afford to have the consultant to do all the actual work, but his guidance showed Cliff which characteristics might qualify as game changers. Cliff was now barely sleeping. Pressure and brutal hours are what awaits those who delay their own adjustments to the new realities of the marketplace. But Cliff managed to find at least a plausible game changer. His company had a low-selling product that would have been extremely useful to a much larger market, but it was far too expensive. If Cliff and his team could lower the cost of manufacturing dramatically, they should have a killer new product. Now Cliff needed to make this innovation happen. What's your solution? Yolanda hit the ground running, although at the same time she was very annoyed with herself. You see, years ago she'd thought of a solution to the problem of how to recruit the best talent, but she had given it no further thought. Why did you just shelve the idea back then? I asked. I don't know, she said. Maybe I just got too comfortable in my job. I remember worrying at the time that it might not work. And then what would have happened? I asked. Would you have gotten fired? Yolanda took the jab with good humor. It didn't matter anymore. Yolanda was on the march. She had game. Yolanda had the basic idea of her innovation in her head, but she needed a working prototype, since it included a software component. She consulted her team of advisors, who had already rallied around her in the aftermath of her termination. She networked to add a software expert to her unpaid team. A friend of a friend later, Yolanda had a working prototype. There was still a lot of development work to do, but she could now prove that her idea worked. Yolanda reoriented her job search, offering herself, her experience, and now her ideas for how to improve recruitment. Yolanda ended up with more than one offer. In her new job, Yolanda was determined that once she'd implemented her recruitment innovation, she'd move on to the next improvement. She had learned how essential that was. Cliff was having less success. Every solution he came up with was just a version of a product that already existed and was still far too expensive. Cliff was so conditioned to using the textbook recipe instructions to solve problems that being original and creative seemed beyond him. And his team, whose conditioning matched his, was equally at a loss. What to do? Cliff just kept at it. He encouraged his team to analyze their problem yet again. Was there a component in the product that could be eliminated? No. Was there an expensive component that could be redesigned to be cheaper? No. Could some of the features be eliminated? No, all were valued by the customers. Could a technology be moved from another application to Cliff's product? No. Nothing appeared relevant. He led his team in a brainstorming session and also tried to identify any mistakes that they or other companies had made with regard to the product. Were there untested assumptions that would offer them insight? Nothing stuck. Cliff confided that he wondered whether he was just too unimaginative to dream up an important innovation. I urged Cliff to be patient and to persist. He was under an enormous amount of stress, and the challenge looked insurmountable. Of course he had moments of questioning himself. That's only natural. But he was forgetting that innovation is not meant to be easy. If it were, where would the competitive advantage be? I reminded him that innovation was a practiced skill, and that he had only just begun to practice. That made sense. To him, as an amateur ranked tennis player, he understood the value of practice. But he also had to practice that elusive skill of knowing when to quit one idea and to move on to another one. Then, while Cliff was commuting home one evening, the confluence of persistence, inspiration, and a critical mass of information came together. This was not lightning striking, this was information congealing. Building on the work of his team, Cliff noticed that the original product design had been done for a select group of large, deep-pocketed, elite customers. Restraining cost had not been important. And that was the real problem. The entire design was inherently expensive. He and his team had been trying to modify the basic design to a lower cost. And that is why it proved to be a lost cause. But if the team completely disregarded the original design and started from scratch, they could imagine a completely different approach to a product that would meet the same purpose as the expensive one. By the time Cliff reached home, he'd thought of several alternative low-cost technologies he could use. The bottom line? Cliff kept his promotion. But Professor, common excuses to innovation. I recognize that having to innovate for career success is intimidating to those who haven't yet done it. And I am frequently told when I make this argument to innovate that there are exceptions to it. Such as, but my employer doesn't want me to innovate. I believe students when they tell me this. I believe it because I see it all the time. One employer told an employee who was making a suggestion for an improvement, "That's not your job." A direct quote. On the contrary, suggestions for innovation are not annoyances or signs of arrogance, they are a necessity. People who came of age in a time when innovation was not as crucial as it is today don't always value it, they don't do it, and they can even feel threatened by those who encourage it. I have watched law firms flounder because they believed that courting new clients was beneath them. I have watched behemoth corporations like General Motors fail because they did not see and value the change around them. So can you guess what I tell students who come to me and say they're Company has a real lack of regard for innovation? I tell them, of course, it's time to find another employer. Get out ahead of a termination, because that employer will not survive. In the end, it doesn't matter what the employer or employee wants, it's the marketplace that will ultimately decide, and in a competitive economy, only those firms that innovate will survive. But I work in a helping profession. Social work innovation doesn't apply to me. The great company of teachers, healthcare workers, social workers, and counselors of every kind are often cited as exceptions to the innovation rule. For these occupations, people feel they need only competence in their field, communication skills, and empathy. But are they really exempt from the dictates of competition? Consider Helen, a nurse in a major medical facility. She loves her work, is well trained, and enjoys the profound satisfaction of helping patients return to health or achieve the best quality of life possible. However, Helen faces severe workload pressure from the increasingly complex needs of her patients, from ever-expanding treatment options, and from hospital management that is trying to rein in the relentlessly rising cost of healthcare. All the nurses strenuously complain about the shortage of staff and the risks associated with what they see as understaffing. Helen, fiercely committed to her patients' well-being, didn't just complain, she took action. She started proposing changes in workplace practices and in facilities, all to reduce the low-value work she and her colleagues found themselves performing. She developed a better tracking system to avoid patient distress before it occurred. Helen attracted attention to herself by doing so. When the position of head nurse in her unit became available, the most experienced nurse who had long advocated for more resources from a resource-constrained organization, remember, applied for the job. In times past, the job would have been hers almost automatically. The job went to Helen instead. The more experienced nurse was bitterly disappointed, and I felt sorry for her. She had no idea what had happened. But she was out of her place in the slipstream of time. Helen, meanwhile, will undoubtedly become the hospital's director of nursing one day. Helen clearly understood the need for innovative solutions in the hospital, and she knew how to implement them. And then there is Bruce, a highly committed mental health counselor who deals with suicidal youth. It would be difficult to express his passion and dedication for preventing the deaths of young people by their own hand. By the time I met Bruce, he'd long exerted every ounce of his training and experience to help those who fell under his care. But Bruce did not always succeed, and he felt each loss personally. Indeed, Bruce's family became concerned for his own mental well-being in such a harrowing and demanding job. I asked him why he wasn't trying to innovate. His first reaction to that suggestion was to dismiss it, that it was crazy. Then he thought about it some more and started to wonder the same thing. His supervisor had once told him, "We can't win them all. We just try as hard as we can." Suddenly, what had been comforting words now sounded hollow. Maybe we can't win them all, he thought, but we need to find better ways to help. That involved more than trying as hard as he could. That meant finding better ways to do his job. So Bruce became an aggressive innovator. Dissatisfied with the initial screening tool used to identify high-risk youth, he developed his own screening techniques and began the research protocol necessary to validate them. Can those in the helping professions really believe that there can't be improvements at every level? Teaching? Healthcare? Counseling? And if you are in the helping professions or want to enter them, why would you think that the improvements must always come from others? Don't you often complain that the new tools you are given do not work well because some ivory tower academic created them? Would it not be more logical that the frontline worker is best positioned to create practical innovations to improve service? Too many talented people simply wait for others to take action. What an odd response for those who say they are committed to helping others. Apparently, that commitment does not extend to innovating in order to help. Have I struck a nerve? I'm not sorry my intent was to light a fire in your mind. But you're clearly picking exceptional examples, Professor. Most people can't create tools like Helen and Yolanda, or have great breakthroughs. Like Cliff did. I'll acknowledge that the stories I've told in this chapter are about people who are not average workers. But remember, we are talking about great careers, not average ones. And if you suppose that these constitute a very small handful of examples I know of, then you are mistaken. They're not the majority yet, but their numbers grow all the time. As they do, more and more organizations will adopt the expectation for exceptional. Indeed, I know people who have sped up their careers and served society by delivering innovation across the widest range of work and industries. There are those whose innovations increased the pace of corporate processes, those who eliminated entire functions, and some of their fellow workmates, those who found new markets or reinvigorated mature ones. Those who lowered costs or drove up productivity, those who increased the likelihood of success in delivering social services, those who developed entirely new product categories, those who pioneered new marketing techniques, those who created new dramatic art, those who created new professional services, and those who brought insight where before there was confusion. The truth is, my problem when planning this chapter was one of having too many examples to share, not a shortage of them. But all of these stories have one common theme: innovation got these people ahead. Why am I so sure that you can innovate? Because I've seen so many men and women from widely different backgrounds do so very successfully, and then go on to use those innovations to craft great careers. To sum up on innovation, let's be clear, being an innovator is difficult work. It takes time to prepare and to execute an idea, and it involves no small amount of frustration. I can't give you all the answers you need to innovate in your field because I don't know your field. But you do. Or you should know it. Backward and forward. You need to know everything about it to understand what it is still lacking. In addition to reading and putting careful thought into your future, I'm telling you to do something else, as well, to dust off and reactivate your rusty imagination, last used when you were around 9 years old. Remember when you looked around your room to determine what materials could make a suitable fort? It's that same creativity, the same imagination you need now. Imagining is not a fast process in a world that celebrates quick results. In fact, it demands even more work. This is why you will need to manage your time carefully. You will need to be disciplined to avoid distractions and to maintain your focus. But you have seen the word discipline in this book before. And the fact that you are still here with me tells me you believe in the importance of discipline. You are already ahead of most. Hard questions, honest answers. 1. What is your unique distinction? 2. How are you tapping into your creativity? 7. Sell yourself by selling your idea. I know. A bad taste just filled your mouth at the idea of pitching yourself. Sadly, too many people seem to recoil at the concept of having to go out in the real world and sell themselves or their ideas. But again, we're being realistic, remember? And the truth is that all the other steps are in vain unless you can mount an effective marketing campaign for yourself. The good news is that you don't have to say, I am so great. Look at me, but instead you can say, I have some great ideas. What do you think about these? Because if a person or company loves your ideas, they will want you. You must be able to deploy all your preparations and to define what distinguishes you. The world needs to know why you are different, and why this difference makes you highly valuable. This message must be clearly defined and sustained throughout your entire career. Such marketing is essential, whether you are just starting out, like Heather and Trent, or you're changing careers, like Ricardo. Self-marketing is equally important for the advancement of an ongoing career. Too many people create an effective career plan that lands them an excellent opportunity, but then they let the planning lapse on the crazy assumption that, although the job came from the plan, the promotion will be automatic. In the past, maybe that was true, but no more. Remember that your plan is for your overall career success, not just for getting a job. Banish the ick factor. The first thing we need to deal with is the fear of selling yourself and your ideas. Though we live in a world of selfies and self-promotion, the truth is that Most people feel uncomfortable blatantly selling themselves in personal encounters. Somehow, they find it demeaning. A friend told me one of the saddest sights she'd ever seen was a man in a vampire costume at a book show, giving out free copies of a vampire novel he'd written. It was beyond depressing, she said. No one wanted to even make eye contact with the guy. We all felt he was embarrassing himself in his desperation to be noticed. Then there are those who have a product they're trying to sell you, and they do so with such vigor that even as you try to pass them by on the street or hang up the telephone, they make it impossible for you not to appear rude. These are horrible examples of salesmanship, and anyone who would consider selling their ideas in such a way would be well advised to improve their judgment before anything else. In other words, don't worry. I am not going to advise you to take extreme measures like these. Quite the contrary. Marketing yourself convincing others of your value is more of a subtle art, and one that can be mastered without being obnoxious or wearing vampire teeth. Define yourself, or someone will do it for you. Bart was a passionate landscape gardener whose creations were mystically beautiful. His customers routinely described his work as exceptional, amazing, brilliant, and never seen anything like it. But he had a big problem. His creations were typically very expensive, and he soon exhausted his pool of local clients. Furthermore, he was so good that no one wanted to change their gardens after he was finished. In other words, he had few repeat customers. Bart, however, was smart, and he decided to innovate. He started to use less expensive materials and plants to lower his costs and expand his market. Unfortunately, he was known as the rich person's gardener, and the few ads he placed in local publications brought in only a handful of leads. And even then, when he met a prospective new client, he had trouble closing a sale. I'd known Bart for years, and he came to see me to discuss what was going wrong. He was passionate and skilled, and his new, less costly gardens seemed even more striking than the previous versions he'd designed. But he was stuck with the distinction he'd earned by default. He'd never wanted to be the gardener to the rich. When I asked him whose gardener he wanted to be, he said, "I want to be the gardener of those who value the disciplined beauty of richly varied plants and blooms." His eyes got a faraway look that showed me just how much he loved his work. He was clearly envisioning gardens as we spoke. But the customer Bart wanted was not the customer his reputation attracted. He was trapped in the wrong identity, and it was limiting both his artistic freedom and his income. Bart worried he might have to uproot his family and start anew in another community, where his reputation wasn't known. Bart needed to take initiative and redefine his professional image. It would have been better, obviously, if he'd defined himself as he wished to be known from the beginning, instead of getting rid of one image and then building another. And to make an already challenging task more challenging, he was very clear that he did not want to be a salesperson. "Why are you so reluctant to sell yourself and your design innovations?" I asked him. "Could it be that you don't believe in your own capability, or the quality of your ideas?" "That's not it at all," Bart insisted. "I just don't want people to think I'm a huckster. I mean, nobody likes a salesperson." Well, perhaps Bart didn't like salespeople. And I'll acknowledge that no one likes the pushy telemarketing call. But millions do look to sales professionals for guidance about everything from cars to electronics to cosmetics. Bart was right to make sure he wasn't confused with a disreputable sales scammer, but I suspected there was more to his reluctance than that. Slowly, it became clear that the huckster problem was a convenient cover for Bart's shyness. His shyness was not immediately obvious, because he wasn't an antisocial loner. He was married and had a community of good friends. But in a group of strangers such as potential clients he was plainly uneasy. After he got to know someone, he became comfortable, but it took him a relatively long time. So how could this naturally quiet person become an effective advocate for himself? Or was Bart forever at a disadvantage because of his shy personality? I fully accept that Bart, and many others like him, are at some disadvantage in promoting their ideas. But he should nevertheless try his Personality is not an excuse for going bankrupt. I'm not suggesting that he undergo a radical personality transplant. He's not going to run for mayor or become the life of the party every time he enters a room. But the fact is that all of us, in some way or other, are going to have to leave familiar turf if we're going to have a great career. Your trusty professor, a shy country boy, had to. And it might well turn out that what Bart thinks is an immutable personality characteristic isn't. But professor, I often hear, I have to be true to myself. I am who I am. People say this to me all the time when I encourage them to step out of their comfort zones. But it's never that simple. If Bart was going to be true to himself, he also had to be true to the expression of his talent. So which truth had to yield? The truth of his talent or the truth of his shyness? That was the sharp-edged choice Bart had to face. I bluntly asked him, when you die, do you want your family and your community to remember that you were shy, or do you want them to remember your gardens? Bart did not take more than a moment to decide that it was his gardens. As I said, beautiful gardens were his passion. And his passion gave him courage. Imagine how stressful it would be for you to sell yourself if you were shy. And you had no emotional attachment to the product of your work. Ever wonder why so much of sales seems insincere? That's because it is. Bart saw the wisdom of breaking out of his comfort zone. Nevertheless, he was daunted by the task ahead of him, and it was a big one. But his story also shows a clear silver lining. There are many ways to define and to market your work. It won't be easy, but Bart could at least choose what his distinction would be. I will come back to Bart's predicament later in the chapter so you can see how he found the solution to overcoming his shyness and reluctance to sell himself. Defining yourself with your words. Words are shallow, said my former student Stanley. Marketing is just spinning words to confuse or manipulate people. I couldn't deny that. Yes, that's sometimes true. But not always. Unfortunately, many of us have little experience in expressing ourselves. About ourselves. This lack of practice greatly limits the interview skills of job applicants, whose career prospects plummet right out of the gate. They know they have to present themselves well, of course. They know about dressing appropriately, shaking hands firmly. There are no spelling mistakes on their resumes, which must follow a standard format. They know to ask sensible questions about their potential job duties. The result? An army of clones saying almost the same thing, with almost no apparent conviction or passion. Stanley was one of those who followed this pedestrian model, even though he cared deeply about his career as a chef and was uncommonly innovative. But he didn't show enough respect for the power of words, and he unintentionally presented himself as a soldier chef, one of the many who graduated from professional cooking schools. He said nothing interesting about himself or cooking. He had a resume with an impressive culinary certification and a few cooking jobs, and he decided to let that speak for him. Stanley came to see me when he was laboring as a cook in the institutional kitchen of a global hospitality company. After preparing the same meal for what seemed like the millionth time, he was crushed by boredom. He asked for a few tips to look for a better job. He was incredibly frustrated, for he had many ideas about how to prepare new kinds of dishes, ideas he'd been given no opportunity to try out. Who asks the common soldier to lead the army into battle, except in the movies? Stanley was now ready to respect and to accept the power of words. Without taking this step, he feared his career was running into a dead end. Remember this, words define you to the world and to yourself. I've listened to hundreds of talented men and women try but fail to tell me about themselves, their interests, and their goals. Even when I ask lots of pointed questions, their responses wander far and wide, without reaching any destination. When you have to express your talent in a few words, you discover how very difficult it is. So let's take it step by step. The elevator pitch: brief, distinctive, and enticing. The phrase elevator pitch originated among startup investors who insisted that entrepreneurs should be able to describe their ventures in the 15 seconds it takes for a typical elevator ride. In other words, you should be able to describe yourself and your idea in just a few sentences, so that no matter how casual the occasion, you can pitch yourself. The goal is to leave no marketing opportunity wasted. Sound too aggressive? Sound like you are supposed to always be in pitch mode? Are you rolling your eyes because you think this approach is what's wrong with the world? Well, this ever alert to opportunity stance is the natural consequence of our world's competitive pressures. If you need a refresher on those pressures, go back and read chapter 1 again. But I don't want to be an entrepreneur, many students insist when I tell them about the elevator pitch. I just want a great job. Ah, but you are an entrepreneur. And your venture is yourself. It's a venture that has to be defined, polished, and marketed. The truth is, successful ventures and successful careers are much closer together than you might have thought. So put your startup face on, and let's learn how to pitch yourself. Violet was a passionate art historian. There seemed to be absolutely nothing that she did not find interesting about her field. She was fascinated by its larger-than-life personalities, the underlying technologies of art, the historical context, the social impact, and the metaphorical interpretation, to name only parts of her interests. I learned to never ask about specific things, like fresco painting techniques, because she would answer me at great length. She spoke with enthusiasm, and a conversation with her about art could be both stimulating and exhausting. Notwithstanding all of this, she had never really defined herself. And as a result, her career was stalled. Violet had plenty of words to say, they just weren't the right ones or framed in the right way. She was still at the first job she had secured after graduation, working as a part-time curator in a reputable art gallery. But though she'd been there for 4 years already, it did not look like she would get promoted anytime soon, and she had not gotten any of the jobs she'd applied for at other galleries. Actually, she was only rarely even getting an interview. The gallery world was closely knit, and Violet attended every event she could, where she thought she networked effectively. In short, Violet didn't understand what the problem was. She'd even taken to carrying a compact mirror with her at all times and compulsively checking her teeth. Perhaps she had a tendency to get food stuck in them, and that was the issue. To uncover the problem, I asked Violet for her 15-second elevator pitch. What I got was a 4-paragraph sermonette, and even then I had to stop her. It was no wonder her networking opportunities weren't fruitful. And it had nothing to do with her teeth. It's not that Violet should just say, "Hello, I'm Violet, an art historian." That's a greeting, not a pitch. The goal of the pitch is to invite further dialogue with a purpose. But first she had to evoke interest. So, first I suggested that she should stop telling others why art was interesting to her. Instead, Violet needed to interest the person she was talking to in Violet. That meant speaking to the listener's needs, not her own. And for those of you who think marketing is inherently sleazy, please notice that you start by focusing on others, not yourself. Tell me, I said, how your passion can help others. Which others? Others who need your help, I replied. Is that people who buy art? People who run galleries? People who go to galleries? All of the above. Yes, all of them. I could define myself as someone who helps collectors buy quality art, she suggested. Better, I said. But far from distinctive. Don't many, if not most, art consultants make the same pitch? You need a sharper definition, a special innovative insight. Or, I added lightly, are you just competent? Violet glared at me. She knew that by suggesting she was merely competent, I was damning her with faint praise. No, she said. You know that, Professor. I'm much more than competent. How so? I asked. Because, she said quickly, I take a much more comprehensive view of art than most so-called experts. Then, in her exasperation with me, I could see the lights begin to go on. I could say I identify new artists that others miss. Stop, I advised. That is the basis of your pitch. Violet needed to be aware of her tendency to run on, and she had to know to pull back once. She'd laid her hook in simple terms. Let the other person ask how you do it. Notice now the characteristics of Violet's pitch. 1. Short. 2. Distinctive, I do something others do not. 3. Expressed in a way that invites the listener to ask for more information. Let's unpack these 3 items a bit. Before Violet could describe her talent succinctly, she first had to figure out what it was. She needed to decide what was important to share and what wasn't. She had to strip her talent down to its essential elements, refined in the fire of brevity. Most critically of all, she could not take cover in a comfortable embrace of generalities. The best elevator pitch for Violet was simply, I identify new artists that others miss. It was perfect. This is one of the best rules of communication, let the other person ask before you provide an answer. It might then mean that the listener is, well, actually listening. The fear I hear a lot is, but what if my interest doesn't match what an employer is looking for? Isn't it safer to be more general, so that they can slot me in wherever they want? Yes, you might fit their job, but it might not be your job, the job you should have, the job your talent demands. Bart, too, had to create a pitch. He was very interested in the 15 seconds rule because he was more comfortable when he had to say fewer words. I make beautiful gardens, he offered as a start. And that's a good contrast to your competitors. I asked. I suppose. They say they make ugly gardens. Oh, right, Bart laughed. Good point. What kind of beauty is in your gardens? I asked. Again, the goal is to define distinction by striking to the heart of the matter. Bart struggled a bit. Because this man of few words knew what he meant but had never really put it into a short and precise pitch. He was truly of the old school, the very old school, back when your work spoke for you. Bart was quiet for a long time, then he said, I design gardens whose beauty is expressed in 1,000 surprises. It was a great pitch. It invited an obvious question, what kind of surprises? Again, a dialogue, a relationship, was now underway. Like Violet's, his pitch was short and intriguing, a baited hook, fishing for interest. Bart and Violet now had pitches that were distinctive, not too general. And, importantly, not too narrow. Let me clarify a bit, because this is an important point. Imagine Violet's prospects if she'd said she loved the history of Impressionist artists who worked in southern Italy from 1936 to 1940, or do you think Bart would make progress if he said he loved French-style gardens with cherry trees and daisies? Probably not, but people say such things all the time. What if someone claims he wants to work with 3D imaging for Disney, using classic cartoon characters in manga style story format? That's an idea for a piece of work, and it might even be an innovative idea. But it is not a precise description of talent or its distinction. The goal is to be precise about the body of work you wish to create. Bart and Violet had a vision for this, and it would power their careers and set their direction. Finally, note that Violet's and Bart's pitches are much more than just phony come-ons, for the simple reason that they are authentic and true. Violet really does study a multitude of factors to find overlooked artists, and she delivers results. And Bart's gardens are surprising in many ways, making them innovative. There is truth in advertising, which is the only way to succeed. You cannot build a great career on just hype. The follow-up paragraph, the hook and the how. Having hooked the interest of their listeners, both Bart and Violet needed to create a script to handle the follow-up questions. Bart had to show how he infuses surprise into the very old art form of landscape gardening. And Violet had to explain how her comprehensive approach finds overlooked artists. They needed to see their scripts as a paragraph, not a chapter. Brevity is always a friend in a time-starved world. Yet the first goal of the follow-up paragraph is actually not to answer the how question, it's to strengthen the hook. In fishing jargon, you jerk the line and pull the hook in so the fish cannot wriggle off. The same is true in networking/marketing sessions. The relationship between the person advancing an idea and the person listening to the argument is tenuous. So, Bart, in response to the listener's vague expression of interest, needed first to solidify that interest, as did Violet. The best way to do that is to surprise the listener with a relevant fact, not an opinion. One of the fastest ways to impress anyone is to tell them something that's much different from what they would have assumed. Now you look interesting, not just your idea. The listener is implicitly wondering what other surprises will be revealed. Offer just one surprising fact, not a blizzard of them. Otherwise you will quickly look like an arrogant bore to be avoided like the plague. Bart didn't like talking to strangers, so he would do well in this regard. Violet, in contrast, would have to restrain herself, so enthusiastic was her style of speech. Bart struggled with what his fact would be, and came to realize two important lessons. First, by trying to figure out what fact might surprise his listeners, he started to put himself in their place. This is exactly right. You do not win people over unless you can get into their minds. If you can figure out what will surprise them, or make them smile or frown, you will then see how they will respond to your entire argument. Second, Bart saw that a surprising fact can often spark a creative insight. He grasped that his past customers liked having things in their gardens that others did not. They liked showing visitors new, unconventional plants. So, Bart chose to open his paragraph with the observation that the average garden contained no more than 1% of all the plants that could conceivably be used. He wasn't sure what the actual number was, but to his trained eye, that was a crude approximation. He decided he would find out for sure. The clear implication conveyed in only 2 sentences is that Bart's designs use many types of plants. Let's look at the flow of Bart's script. Listener, and what do you do? Bart, I'm a landscape gardener, and I specialize in gardens with hidden surprises. Listener, what kinds of surprises? How do you do that? Bart, it's pretty straightforward, actually. I'm amazed that the average garden contains no more than 1% of all the plants that could be used. My gardens, by contrast, contain at least 10%. Of course, I have to be very careful to make sure these highly varied plants complement each other. A word of caution, never say "did you know" to anyone you are pitching yourself to. That sounds too much like one-upsmanship. The 10% benchmark came to Bart as he composed his script. Interesting, is it not, how necessity fuels good ideas? Bart was already thinking of plants he had never considered using. Violet followed a similar approach and produced this script. Listener, so, what do you do? Violet, I'm an art consultant, and I love finding artists that others have missed. Listener, really? Do you find overlooked artists very often? Violet, yes, quite often. It was quite a revelation to me that, of the century's top 50 artists, 30 of them became famous only after they were dead. But if you take a broad view, there are a lot of common elements to great art. When Violet and I worked on her script, she did not have the precise numbers, though she was eager to find them. The pitches are, of course, intended only to be relevant to a specific target. For Bart and Violet, they are directed to lovers of gardens and art only. Both Bart and Violet now had a dialogue underway with those potential clients. They could use slightly modified versions of their elevator pitches and follow-up paragraphs for networking events, job interviews, sales presentations, and even cocktail parties. The one-pager, talking points for deeper dialogue. Once you've hooked your listener and intrigued him with your fascinating fact and innovative distinction, it's time to drill down and drive it home. The one-pager is a series of talking points in which you deploy a few more interesting and important facts about your domain, the nature of your key innovation, with examples and alternative ideas and suggestions for different groups of people. Make sure you actually write this part down. Obviously, you're not going to pull it out of your pocket or purse during a conversation and refer to it, but writing it all down will help you solidify, organize, and memorize your thoughts. Here's an example of what Violet's might look like. Violet's one-pager. Talk about Mitch O'Donnell and his crazy story of being discovered after doing artwork for his kid's school auction. People love this story. Mention Gabriella, who I found right out of art school when I went and spoke to the school instructors and whose work is now worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Talk about how other experts only read trade journals to find talent and overlook sources like Instagram or Pinterest. For more traditional clients, definitely tell that story about how I brought hundreds to a gallery show by partnering with a revered winery. A common concern among those who have been on the receiving end of this advice is that following a script is going to sound artificial. They want to improvise. Unfortunately, they often later admit that their improvised conversations did not go all that well. In addition to forgetting a key point, they went off topic, found themselves in a conversational dead end, or repeated themselves 3 times. It's true that the first time you practice your script, it will most likely sound wooden or artificial. And when you talk to someone like this for the first time, it will sound contrived, especially if you think you sound like me, and not like yourself. But by the 10th time, you will, like magic, now sound like you, even though you're using the exact same words you used the previous 9 times. Why? You just became accustomed to the sound of your own voice saying words that no longer feel new or awkward. Remember this too, words matter. Stanley, our chef, managed to put aside his preconceptions about marketing, and his results were quick and powerful. He introduced himself as a chef who loves giving diners upscale presentations of comfort foods. He delighted in talking about how a buttermilk fried chicken breast could be transformed by topping it with a celeriac puree, or how mac and cheese could be prepared with Dungeness crab and served in a small, Spanish-style cazuela. Not long after he'd implemented his new strategy, Stanley had a new job at a restaurant known for its innovative cuisine and willingness to take risks. Defining yourself with your actions. While the right words are critically important to define and to promote your distinctive talent, they are not enough. While well-crafted words describe what you can do, have done, or would like to do, showing someone what you have created is one of the most powerfully persuasive acts available. Its effect should not be underestimated. Yes, Bart should describe his vision for his garden of surprises, but nothing substitutes for showing a prospective client one of the gardens he has created, which he could do through postcards, business cards, his website, and even simply a snapshot on his phone, depending on the formality of the conversation. Bart is very comfortable in this space. He's long felt comfortable letting his work speak for him. But what about Violet? What sample of her work could she show? Well, she could show the work of one of the overlooked artists she'd identified. She could lead a gallery tour demonstrating the hallmarks of great artists she has found. Both Bart and Violet have the advantage of working with visual, physically embodied products. And Stanley can always make someone a meal or show photos of his plating techniques. As a lawyer seeking a job, Kylie didn't have these same advantages. What could she do? Draw up a sample contract? Sue someone for malpractice? She could easily use words to describe her unique insights, but how to show them? She felt passionately, for instance, that corporate bylaws could create humane and highly efficient workplaces. But no matter how eloquently Kylie spoke of these ideas, at her current job she was stuck drawing up routine contracts with a bewildering number of minor iterations. In other words, no one wanted to give Kylie a shot based on her ideas. They needed real, tangible proof. And it makes sense, given the quantity of scammers, con artists, spin masters, exaggerators, and wheelers and dealers. Skepticism as a first reaction is warranted. While words are very important, they are also in many ways cheap. It is far easier to say that you will do something than to actually do it. So how could Kylie overcome this obstacle when no one would give her a chance? In addition to skepticism, Kylie faced another foe, a culture that lacked imagination. This cultural lack is one of the most formidable obstacles to anyone pursuing a great career. Great careers are driven by the innovations that arise from passion. But such visions of what could be created are difficult for the unimaginative to grasp. And that's part of the reason unimaginative people turn their backs on great careers. To fight both of these obstacles, Kylie needed a sample of her imaginative work. The problem For some passionate careers, the nature of the sample is not immediately obvious. Kylie struggled with this dilemma for some time. She wrote several papers for scholarly journals, spoke at conferences, and advocated her ideas before senior lawyers. There had been a few expressions of vague interest, but nothing really significant had occurred. Kylie was now not sure whether she should continue trying along these lines. Perhaps she should generate other ideas in a similar vein, but she felt she'd likely find herself in the same place. Yes, Kylie could just keep trying, and over years she might succeed. In many cases, long persistence will pay off in great careers. But it's a riskier choice solely because it plays out over a longer period of time, where more things can change or go wrong. Surely it serves Kylie better to be successful sooner rather than later. And if she is successful sooner, Kylie will be even more creative over her lifetime, which serves everyone. Kylie needed to apply her ingenuity to produce a sample of her vision. She needed to take action. As a practical matter, she needed to figure out what was the smallest realization of her idea but was still big enough to be persuasive. It took her some experimentation and a couple of dead ends, but finally she got it. She approached a small charity and volunteered to redraw their corporate bylaws to improve their operations. All Kylie asked in return was to be allowed to evaluate the effects of the new governance structure. She then repeated the process with a big 8. Execute and revise. None of the planning process is effective if execution is not careful and sustained. Execution takes focus and hard work, and people are quick to offer excuses to abandon the effort altogether. The truth is, about half of the career plans I learn of are aborted before completion, or after a first job. And no one has ever given me a good reason as to why they've given up. In the next section we'll delve into the excuses they give. Willingness to re-evaluate your plan periodically and revise, if necessary, is just as important as strong execution. Be disciplined about your plan, but not so rigid that you cannot see room for improvement or be willing to change. An unexpected change in your plan does not mean quitting, tossing it out altogether. All plans change, and good ones can handle detours or even just bumps along the way. For instance, every plan should take into account what to do in case of a recession or layoffs. How will you revise your plan when the time comes? In many cases, my students don't ditch their plans at all but improvise some sort of temporary employment. Having a plan is what helps them maintain their longer-term focus while weathering what comes in the meantime. The key to re-evaluating your plan and assessing whether you need to revise is simple: create benchmarks. These are the interim steps necessary for all the guidelines I've gone over in part 2 of this book. How do you know your plan is actually working if you don't have benchmarks? You wouldn't set up a yearly budget without checking monthly to see how you're doing. Companies would never neglect to establish benchmarks, and your company of one shouldn't neglect this important step, either. As the saying goes, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But notice that in your process of re-evaluation, you might conclude you have adopted the wrong benchmark. To better understand benchmarks, let's look at one of the strategies I discussed in Chapter 5, identify, acquire, and strengthen the key skills you need. You can already clearly see that that's 3 to-dos, not 1. But it's actually many more. If acquiring the skills you need involves attending graduate school, benchmarks could include researching the right programs and visiting prospective schools. And I'm still not done. Further, benchmarks would be asking professors and current students questions in order to assess that school's suitability for you. Think about how many benchmarks you can include with each step in your plan. Set specific days that you will go over your benchmarks to gauge whether you are on track. Sometimes, that's how you'll notice that one of your steps won't work. Perhaps when you research the right programs, you learn that the best programs for you will take twice as long to complete as you'd anticipated. So revise your plan. Benchmark, review, revise, repeat. This is how you move forward. 3 critical questions. Logical though the preceding steps are: benchmark, review, revise, repeat. They are not easy to follow effectively. With the pace of today's economy, you must react quickly to a never-ending stream of new data. You must have constancy of purpose while at the same time exhibiting great flexibility at a tactical execution level. In some ways, these two priorities are exact opposites of each other. Inability to balance the two causes many people to be reactive instead of thoughtful. My student Nelson had done everything right. He had carefully identified his overriding passion, graphic design, and had developed a thoughtful plan to strengthen his innovative techniques and to market himself and his ideas. He knew he'd love to be an art director someday. Unfortunately, shortly after launching his plan, his career stalled. He didn't meet certain benchmarks, in his case, promotions, he'd set for his rise to his dream job. He reconsidered, adjusted his plan, created new benchmarks, and set off again. Then, another stall, so Nelson revised his approach once more. Among the new benchmarks he planned for, started toward, and then rejected were more training, international experience, working for a boutique firm, and working for a global company. As a result of the inconsistency, Nelson's career was lurching forward and sideways, threatening at any moment to veer into the ditch. If you think Nelson was inept or fickle, you're wrong. He was responding to new information and feedback as he executed his plan, which is exactly right. His problem was more systemic. Every time he got more data, he reacted. But data was fully raining down on him, and chasing down every raindrop only gets you lost. He had lost the thoughtfulness of his execution. Here's what he needed to do, which is just what you must do. First, when new and relevant information appears, always ask, would this revision move me closer to my overriding goal of a great career? Beware of a revision that is purely lateral or that only marginally advances you to the ultimate prize. Did your past plan revisions advance your cause? I asked Nelson. Or could they have, had you seen them through? Well, they would have advanced my skills, he said. Yes, but would advancing those particular skills have made you a more desirable art director? Nelson thought about it for a minute before shaking his head. No, I guess not. When Nelson heard about a new training program, for instance, he had immediately applied, assuming it was a good thing, but without thinking of whether or not it would move him forward toward his art director goal. And then he abandoned it altogether when the exciting possibility of an international posting suddenly appeared. In effect, he was reacting to new information, not to a significantly faster pathway to his great career. Since none of the choices would have made a meaningful difference to Nelson's career, it was hardly surprising that he was bouncing around. Now, for the second question, if a new choice is tangibly closer to your goal, will it involve a loss of time that will reduce your advantage? How long would this new training program have taken? I asked Nelson. 3 years. 3 years. I echoed. That seems like a lot. Would it have been worth the time away from your job? Nelson had gained a lot of traction at work, and so no, he determined that the net effect would not have been clearly positive. That doesn't mean that would be the case for every training program. But he should have at least asked the question before taking the trouble to apply to the program. There was a third question Nelson also had to ask: will this revision limit my options? Keep in mind that in addition to guarding his constancy of purpose, Nelson needed to guard his flexibility just as jealously. While the goal of art director working with graphic design stood unchanged, he needed as many pathways to get there as possible. So as Nelson and I discussed the training program, it turned out that it dealt with a very specific type of graphic design and might well have limited his potential pathways forward. That would have to be considered a negative indicator. Yes, the training could have been on balance a wise move, but the trade-off was significant. In a slower, simpler world, this would have been a lesser challenge, but today there is very little room for speed bumps. It's hard to make these judgments, Nelson said, growing frustrated. They are so nuanced. I agree, I said, which is why you must be careful. The key point you need to remind yourself of is that the effect of the revision needs to be clear. Otherwise, stick to the plan you have. Essentially, by asking these 3 questions, we're raising the bar over which a proposed revision needs to jump. In the olden days, by which I mean 20 years ago, not 100, there were fewer reasons for revisions, and so it was less of a challenge to vet them. Today, you and Nelson face more occasions to revise. So you must be more selective about which data to react to. The fruitless search for perfection. Finally, Nelson and I had to discuss another reason he was overreacting to new developments. Nelson was afflicted with the belief that he needed a perfect plan, one that moved him toward his goal as quickly as possible, and with the highest likelihood of success. So he was tempted to tinker endlessly. And every time he readjusted, he lost time, and usually for nothing. Many people do this, and they get so disheartened that they give up on planning altogether. The problem was Nelson's belief that a perfect plan exists. I'm a strenuous advocate of career planning, as you have seen. But I did not say your goal was to never make a mistake. The only perfect plan is the one you see in retrospect. I asked Nelson to understand that there were multiple pathways to his great career. The plan he was executing, with occasional revisions, was carefully considered and would, with a high degree of probability, take him to his goal. But he'd be able to arrive there on a different planned route, too. It might be a little faster or slower, but the key issue was arriving at his destination. So yes, plans aren't perfect, but the absence of planning sends you into the unknown. That is, after all, what separates the child from the adult. Understanding that life is about mastering possibilities while staying true to your heart. Hard questions, honest answers. 1. Have you determined what you will do in case of a recession or layoff? How will you adapt your plan? 2. What are your benchmarks? What is your plan for reviewing them?